Hello, everyone, and warm welcome to our webinar called Mastering an ESRS-aligned Sustainability Strategy. A couple of months back, and actually over the last entire year, we've been working extensively with our clients in Denmark, Germany, many other European countries on preparing for the CSRD. One big part that's been getting a bit too little attention for now is what are actually the implications from the ESRS standards towards sustainability strategy. How is sustainability strategy as a practice, as a discipline, going to be changed and influenced by the requirements from the European Sustainability Reporting Standards? This has been the question that we've been asking ourselves over the last few months, and which triggered actually us revisiting all of the standard documents and outlining the requirements from them towards sustainability strategy. Today, Julia and I will be talking about these requirements and will be hoping to educate a bit more and to inform your future sustainability strategy practices. After just having concluded a couple of opening and welcome remarks, which we're already in the middle of, this is how we're going to structure today's webinar. We'll be talking a bit about the spirit of the CSRD, which we think is important to understand how to interpret some of the requirements from the standards. Afterwards, we're going to walk you through the different requirements that we've identified and hope to just educate a bit more on what the standards require. We also wanted to provide a perspective on how to use sustainability strategy as a lever for creating commercial value beyond compliance, because of this is of course what drives ultimately the traction and the value creation in the business. In the end, we wanted to have a practical application of some of the requirements of the ESRS with regards to the business model and strategy analysis. In the very end, we'll have roughly 15 minutes for a Q&A session. Just a couple of admin remarks. Please make sure to use the Q&A function in the bottom of the Zoom application here. We'll be trying to answer all of the questions as we are in the Q&A block. Should there be any questions unanswered, we'll try to get back to you afterwards. You're of course also free to provide questions anonymously if you feel more comfortable doing so. We'll be using this function to make sure that we have a good and informative Q&A session. I also just wanted to mention that we'll be recording this webinar and we'll be sharing the slides afterwards, so don't worry about missing out on any information. You'll all get the materials after the session. So to begin with, just a bit of background. Who are we at Nordic Sustainability? We provide strategic sustainability consulting. Our vision here in all of the work that we're doing, and whether it has to do with CSRD, with climate, circular economy, or sustainability strategy, is to work towards societies where companies succeed and people thrive within planetary boundaries. And we try to do that by accelerating business transformation, and which is the key role that we see in all of the work that we are doing. We've worked with many clients across many different European countries who work in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Germany, Switzerland, and so on and so forth. And some of our clients are some of the green champions of the EU, really trying to transform their businesses towards a sustainable business model. I myself, my name is Felix. I'm a manager at Nordic Sustainability. I am leading the sustainability strategy team here. I've been doing so for around 3 years. I have in total around 7-8 years of experience in the corporate sustainability sphere, and I've worked with a variety of different companies in that industry. I've been part of Volkswagen, I've been part of Flying Tiger Copenhagen, I've been part of Vestas, always working with corporate sustainability, business transformation, and these interesting challenges. Today with me, I have my colleague Julia, and I'll hand over to her for a short introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Felix. I'm Julia. I'm a senior consultant here at Nordic Sustainability and have for the past 2 years been working primarily just with a focus on the CSRD, especially with the first steps of it, your double materiality assessment, your data gap and information materiality that comes after it, and have the past year really been working towards implementing CSRD within businesses. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today.
Great. So let's get started with learning about what the ESRS actually require of sustainability strategies. Before we dive into details, which is going to be the place where we end up today, I think it's important to put a couple of words towards the overall transformation that we see happening in the commercial environment. A couple of years back, for example, when I had my first experiences working with corporate sustainability, there were basically two kinds of companies. Traditional companies where there was no consideration at all for ESG aspects of the business, and there were companies called so-called sustainability leaders. Those were companies that had already made an imprint on the sustainability agenda, have maybe set some targets, some reduction targets, operationalized it to a certain degree. However, of course, it's fair to say that even those sustainability leaders were far from anything that we can call truly sustainable in terms of the business model and how businesses are being run. Now, what we see with the EU legislation coming out, the entire package, so CSRD, CSDD, the EU taxonomy, there's many other legislative packets worth mentioning here, but just to name a few, what we see is that there's basically a mandatory transformation kickoff for most companies, and not just the sustainability leaders in certain sectors, but the business environment as such, where it is mandatory to think about how can business models be aligned with a sustainable end state, talking about metrics and targets and linking it to the commercial activities. And all this is, of course, to drive the private sector to be in line with the overall EU outcome targets of, for example, wanting to be the first climate neutral continent. And I'm saying these things because it's important in terms of how we interpret the spirit of CSRD. In the end, here at Nordic Sustainability, we're sustainability experts, which is also why initially when we had started out with the question, what does a compliant sustainability strategy look like? We were struggling quite a bit because there's many different ways to interpret the requirements from the standards. Given that it was quite difficult to define sort of the minimum baseline of what you need to do, and I'm going to come back to some of the challenges in line with defining what's good enough, we wanted to go for an interpretation that is in line with what the directive is set out to do, which is to ensure that private sector value creation is about more than financial returns. So including and accounting and working towards mitigating impacts on the society and planet. And here it is important to mention that, of course, the whole thought behind the entire directive is that the EU wants to channel capital into sustainable economic activities, which can only happen if we improve the quality and the consistency of sustainability reporting as such to enable informed decision-making. And of course, in line with that, and channeling capital towards the green transition, that is one of the EU's key instruments towards pushing the corporate world towards an alignment with the Green Deal agenda. So, for example, I've mentioned being the first climate neutral continent, but also, of course, the ambition of leaving no person and place behind, and many of these long-term Green Deal agenda goals that have been set by the EU. Having said this, let's dive a bit into what do the standards actually give away with regards to sustainability strategy. And here's a high-level overview, and we will be diving into many of these aspects a bit closer today. What we have identified are 4 different building blocks and 6 different patterns. Now, what does that mean? The strategy building blocks are key, very well explicitly formulated requirements from the ESRS standards towards what needs to be disclosed as part of the sustainability reporting. Whereas the patterns are a bit less difficult to sort of like spot and less clear-cut, because those are sort of like disclosure requirements that cut across many of the topical standards, so across climate, biodiversity, water, own workforce, and so on and so forth, that we just see popping up again and again and will be very important in defining future work with sustainability strategy. On the building block side, there are 4 elements which we will dive into a bit more today. It's the business model and strategy link. So how does your business model and strategy drive and interact with material impacts, risks, and opportunities, which we see as one of the key requirements to satisfy if a sustainability strategy is to live up with the spirit of the standards. It is about formulating a continuous stakeholder engagement process to make sure that stakeholder voices are heard in strategic decision-making. It's about sustainability governance. So how is sustainability managed? Talking about roles, responsibilities, incentive structures, and so on and so forth. And then very importantly, and I think most of you will have heard of this, the PAT, the PAT structure, standing for policies, actions, and targets, which is a crucial element for the CSRD to anchor disclosures around what are actually the strategic ambitions that a company has in order to manage impacts, risks, and opportunities. And the path structure is also, those are the first three elements we see cutting across the different standards. So depending on which topical standards will be material for you and your company, the PATs, the PATs, the policies, actions, and targets come with specific disclosure requirements, and with that sort of elevate the level of sustainability strategy to a more consistent and higher standard. Interestingly, there are three other patterns. We see a big sort of shift towards an enhanced analytical baseline. We see a requirement towards quantifying financial effects on the business based on sustainability risks and opportunities. And last but not least, for climate and biodiversity, there are extremely prescriptive disclosure requirements that require companies to illustrate how they are transitioning their business in line with eliminating negative impacts for climate and biodiversity. For the reasons of time, we can't go into all of these elements today, so we'll be focusing on the business model and strategy link, on the PAT structure, and then the financial effects modeling. And of course, when we share the material with you afterwards, you'll have the full overview, and please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any reflections or questions, or would just like to discuss some of the other elements that we didn't get the chance to dive deeper into today. All right, then time for details. Let's dive into the strategy building blocks as part of the ESRS. First up, and at least I'm a bit biased because I work with strategy basically day in, day out, but I think one of the most exciting requirements from the standards is the requirement that companies have to understand how their strategy and business model, and here I'm saying commercial strategy and business model, interact with the identified material impacts, risks, and opportunities from the double materiality assessment. And it's not just that understanding part, but also showing how these links are being considered in strategic decision-making going forward. These requirements are being outlined in the general disclosures under ESRS 2. There are three different SBM strategy and business model elements of these disclosures, 1, 2, and 3. And here we've deep dived a bit into 1 and 3, since 2 is mostly about the stakeholder engagement. Under the requirements SBM-1, what companies are required to do and to disclose is basically disclosing and describing a lot of the elements that relate to their commercial business model and strategy, as many companies have already done for a number of years in their annual reporting. So it's about disclosing significant products, services, markets, and customers, relatively standard information like employee headcount, revenue breakdown, but also disclosing, are there any sustainability-related goals in terms of products and services? Is there, for example, a goal for a certain service category that is enabling customers to take more sustainable choices to ramp up the revenue there? But also with regards to, are there any focus areas on customers, geographies, markets, or specific stakeholders? And then what we, of course, commonly see, and what is a common practice in reporting already, is just a visualization and description of how does the business look like. So inputs, outputs, how is the value chain being structured, and what are the main activities that the business undertakes in order to generate value for their customers. These requirements, I think at least, are less complex as compared to the ones in SBM-3. So here the disclosure requirement, quote unquote, says that the undertaking, meaning the company, shall disclose its material impacts, risks, and opportunities and how they interact with its strategy and business model. How this is to be interpreted is that basically the standards require you to take a look at your double materiality assessment results, take a look at what is your commercial strategy and business model, and ask yourself the question, why do we have these certain double materiality assessment results based on the business model that we're having? To give you a quick example, for example, if you're a manufacturing company and you have very high energy intensive processes to, for example, mold or form or shape materials, that is an inevitable connection that you will consume a lot of energy, which potentially can cause greenhouse gas emissions. So there's one sort of business model called business model connections and the sustainability impacts as the outcome. But there's also the other side of the coin, if we think about the double materiality lens, which is that there is, of course, also the logical direction of thinking about how resilient is the business model with regards to the sustainability risks and opportunities identified. So, for example, think about governments increasingly implementing a carbon tax. This could have direct effects on the resilience of a business model. would your business model still be profitable if, for example, some of the externalities would be internalized by having to pay a carbon pricing? And those are some of the thoughts that the standards require you to disclose about as part of the SBM requirements. Right now, there aren't a lot of examples of companies doing exactly that. And of course, that makes sense, given that we are just about to see the first wave of ESRS compliant reports in Q1, Q2 next year. However, on the right-hand side, we have outlined a couple of cases where you can look towards for inspiration. In this case, Ørsted, where there's already sort of like a lot of good thinking, which you can get inspired by in terms of how to disclose in line with the requirements. The second building block, which I'm going to talk about now, is the PAT structure. PAT, again, stands for policies, actions, and targets. And here, what is important to understand is sort of the overall thinking behind the logic of the policies, actions, and targets framework, which is that for your material impacts, risks, and opportunities, the standards are asking you to disclose three things. Basically, first up, the policy. What is your overarching intention towards achieving the outcome, the intended state with regards to that impact, risk, or opportunity? So to give you an example, for a circular economy, this could mean ultimately, and this is not specified in terms of a timeline, we want to transition away from the use of virgin raw materials. Then secondly, we have the target element where then the policy statement, the ambition, which needs to be in line with the overarching EU sustainability agendas, where you're actually supposed to actively reference which sustainability goals from the EU you are taking into consideration. Then the targets are adding sort of the tangibility element to that. So setting targets to track the effectiveness of policies and actions. So for example, having a target that says that secondary materials constitute 50% of all of our materials used by 2027. And then this is supposed to be undermined by actual action. So what are you doing about this? And here, another example would be that we, as a company, trying to transition away from the use of virgin raw materials in line with pursuing our target for 2027. We are implementing a product innovation project where we are shifting towards secondary material components. And then sort of in the flow of things, also, of course, important to consider that resources that are being allocated to mitigating or managing that impact risk opportunity need to be disclosed, as well as the governance structure. So having a clear responsibility for whose responsibility is it to achieve success with the policies, actions, and targets. And at this point, we're diving a bit deeper into some of the cross-cutting patterns that we see, specifically also what requirements are there for policies, actions, and targets. And here I'm handing over to my colleague, Julia.
Thank you. Yeah. So as Felix already spoke a bit into, the backbone of the ESRS report is really about how you're monitoring and managing your IROs, your impacts, risks, and opportunities. And it's across these that you'll have to develop the different policies, actions, and targets are related to each of your material matters. Your report is essentially a manual on how you're monitoring and managing these impacts and risks. As part of the ESRS, you will need to develop policies that provide these clear guidance on addressing material sustainability matters, and that will go across all of your impacts, risks, and opportunities. The CSRD mandates that companies establish these binding guidelines that outline your overall approach to managing your impacts, such as water consumption or waste management. Each policy should include key elements, which are defined under what are called the minimum disclosure requirements, so the MDRs, such as a clear objective, a defined scope, a detailed description of roles and responsibilities in carrying out the policy, and of course, an explanation of how stakeholder interests are taken into account. The CSRD really only makes sense from the strategic angle that Felix has already really spoken about, because while the CSRD and the ESRS are really just reporting mechanisms, your due diligence, whether that's inspired and aligned with international standards, for example, setting SBTi targets, are your guidelines. And while the CSRD does not mandate due diligence, it has requirements in regards to how you manage, track, and monitor your impacts, essentially your due diligence or your PATs. For your actions, a company needs to define the specific actions required to achieve the established targets that you then carry out, that you have also outlined in your policy. You should clearly outline what you will do to meet each target, ensuring that each action is directly linked to a corresponding target. Specificity here is really key to ensuring that every action is purposeful and aligned with the intended outcomes. They also need a clear scope. They need a time horizon for completion, and you need to be able to track and report its progress. This is really a step away from, or a step towards, we can say, towards a more specified reporting. It's really about creating more data-driven reports rather than very marketing-driven reports that we've been used to that have had a very positive storytelling and a narrative from companies. Now it's about actually setting out time-bound actions and targets and policies that will help you guide your way towards your sustainability strategy. Finally, you have your targets. You need to set clear and measurable goals for improvement. These targets should be time-bound, outcome-oriented, and quantifiable to ensure progress can be effectively tracked and achieved. And this is very clear from the ESRS that it's really all about creating very measurable end results. And will become part of your overall strategy, and it will be very difficult to create these policies, actions, and targets in siloed initiatives in your company. We're seeing that this is becoming far more cross-cutting across entire organizations to really make sure that your PATs or your really become part of a change system. We have set some examples aside where we have seen for companies this has worked quite well for example, Tomra on the side here, but you will get this slide deck afterwards as well, where you can dive a bit deeper into some of the examples where we see what companies are currently doing. Felix will take the next slide on your financial effects modeling, so I'll hand over back to him.
Okay, yeah, financial effects is an interesting one. So the standards require companies to quantify the material financial risks and opportunities related to environmental matters. Basically, think about it like in typical enterprise risk management function, like you would also quantify commercial risks, like, for example, having a breakdown of IT infrastructure or a cyber attack, or these sorts of potential incidents. The requirements here with regards to financial effects modeling is that across all of the environmental topical standards, companies need to quantify and disclose the anticipated financial effects from material, so not all sustainability-related risks and opportunities, but the material ones. So, for instance, consider climate change-related physical and transition risks entailing net revenue risk or expected cost savings. So having, for example, a case where some of the business model is being called into question due to the fact that it might be difficult to provide the same product or services if we move towards a world where we have a 2.5-3 degree scenario of global warming. Think about pollution impacts. So, for example, what would happen if a pollution incident would materialize and what that would mean in terms of fines or penalties from a legal regime. Or think about impacts and dependencies related to water and marine resources or biodiversity or ecosystems. There was this interesting study quantifying that roughly 50% of the GDP worldwide depends on intact ecosystems and intact biodiversity. So what would happen in an economy where we see a prolonged trend, as we see it right now, of ecosystem collapse, of species decline? What that would mean for pollination, ecosystem services, clean air, stable climate. All of these are concrete financial effects that companies are required to quantify. And the things that need to be done here is that we need to disclose the financial effects considered, and it can be a range here. It needs to be specified which impacts and dependency this relates to. It needs to be specified the time horizon in which they are likely to materialize. So, for example, for some of the biodiversity or ecosystem or climate ones that might be further out in the future, where something like a pollution-related incident can basically happen anytime, and then also transparently stating critical assumptions and sources. We try to have a look to see whether there are companies out there who already do this very thoroughly. And that's not to say that there's no one out there doing this very thoroughly, but we had a lot of trouble. But we wanted to highlight one interesting case study here from Tesla, because this is not actually Tesla disclosures. This is another organization that has analyzed the case of Tesla and their factory building in Brandenburg in Germany, where the company has been hit by massive commercial consequences due to groundwater shortage. This report estimates that Tesla has missed out on 36 billion US dollars annually due to the groundwater shortage problem. So it's just to underline sort of the magnitude of the problem, that sustainability risks and opportunities are clearly material financial information that will be a crucial component of not only sustainability reporting going forward, but also strategic decision making, because of the idea is, of course, to try to avoid these risks and opportunities from happening and taking the strategic actions before they come to materialize. Okay, those are sort of the overarching, or some of the overarching elements that you can see and find in the standards and their implications on sustainability strategy. But we wanted to end this section of our webinar with a couple of reflections. Amongst all the reporting frameworks, we think that the ESRS set a entirely new and better and higher bar for sustainability strategy. There's so much more of a push for having a consistent approach, having to quantify targets, specify what resources are actually being put into implementation actions. However, we also still see some potential for improvement. Two of the things that we came across and that we were struggling with in our preparation towards this webinar, and of course in our strategic work day to day, are the anchoring of sustainability strategy in science and the scope for interpretation and opting out as part of the ESRS. With regards to the anchoring of sustainability strategies in science, here at Nordic Sustainability, we have always worked with sustainability strategy in a way that we try to link strategic sustainability ambitions, such as, for example, climate targets, to scientific frameworks, such as the planetary boundaries. So, for example, it doesn't make sense to set a climate target that is vastly misaligned with a 1.5 degree Paris scenario. And that has been a cornerstone in our work. And whereas the ESRS tried to establish that links from time to time, we would wish for a more explicit reference to some of the scientific frameworks that are out there to help companies guide their strategic ambitions. Because generally speaking, there are a lot of references to the EU policy agendas, but we would wish for this to be more explicit and more robust, and also importantly, more mandatory, to make sure that the private sector contributes to a truly sustainable transformation of the EU economy. The second shortcoming we see, and now I'm coming back all the way to the remarks I had at the very beginning of this webinar, is the scope for interpretation and opting out. The spirit of the standard and going with that in your sustainability strategy and in your disclosures will significantly increase the level and the speed of the sustainability transformation. However, the CSRD has several very vague formulations that leave quite a lot of room for interpretation and also opting out of some of the requirements. If we, for example, take a look at some of the screenshots here below, I'm quoting from the bottom screenshot, in case the undertaking does not have a transition plan in place, it shall indicate whether, and if so, when it will adopt a transition plan. And of course, this requirement can be answered simply by using that whether and saying, no, we don't have a transition plan, and we are planning to do that in 5, 6, 7, 8 years, whenever the company aims to disclose that, which of course is vastly misaligned with sort of the reality of the speed that we need for the sustainability transformation to happen. Or if you look at this upper left screenshot, the undertaking shall indicate whether and how its policies address the following areas. These sorts of phrasings give, in our interpretation and our perspective, too much room for companies who are currently struggling to act strategically on sustainability to not get started on the agenda. All right, with having gone through some of the more detailed requirements for sustainability strategy as part of the ESRS standards, we wanted to lift the level a bit higher now and talk about sustainability strategy as a lever for creating value beyond compliance. And the way we think about this high level is that to ensure commercial value beyond compliance, impactful strategies have to do at least three things. They have to ensure short-term compliance, so making sure that you align better ahead of EU legislation, specifically also the CSRD. But they will have to do more than that in order to generate commercial value. Otherwise, from compliance only, this is the minimum baseline. It's going to be what every company does. That's not going to generate significant commercial value for a company. Where we think using some of these requirements to drive commercial value creation is in the mid and long term, if done right. For example, in the midterm, by trying to focus on creating competitive advantage. For example, companies will need to find ways to benefit commercially from the work with sustainability, because otherwise they risk out to competitors doing so. And in the long term, it's important to understand and anchor a foundation, a strategic foundation that ensures that the core business model, what the company is doing day in, day out, stays relevant, not just today, tomorrow, but also in 5, 10, 15 years. It basically sets the core foundation for how the business model contributes to solving societal challenges. Going a bit more into depth with the midterm competitive advantage angle, we are thinking about specifically 4 commercial levers that can be used to try to generate this commercial competitive advantage. And the levers here are different in terms of their potential for generating value. And as we see it sort of like on the first level, just being transparent and sort of disclosing about your sustainability performance really mostly will be, and in many industries already is, just about safeguarding the license to operate. In many industries, you need to, for example, B2B tenders, you need to specify, for example, a carbon footprint. And if you can't do that, you can't compete. Where it gets more interesting in terms of commercial value is when you're able to achieve incremental improvements of the existing portfolio. Are you able to deliver and offer a service or product with lower environmental impacts as compared to competitors? That is something that can unlock, for example, a higher share of wallet or some premium pricing. Then thirdly, what will generate even more value is to focus on sustainability and developing innovation. So opening up new revenue streams and potentially premium pricing by offering entirely different services. Could there be a service or product that enables customers to provide whatever they are doing or they are looking for in a more sustainable way? That is really a key sort of like gear change in terms of being able to reap commercial benefits. And then lastly, and I think also most difficult to implement, achieve, and understand, is the value capture through business model innovation and value chain innovation. What I mean with that, when I'm talking about that, is that largely speaking, the biggest strategic opportunities of sustainability arise when you are thinking about how could your value chain and business model look like if it were to be truly compatible with a society that comes closer to, or that has proceeded even more in transgressing planetary boundaries and satisfying core societal needs. One example that I like to talk about a lot is the wind industry, which is also where I have some of my previous work experience, where the industry quite early on has realized we're offering a fantastic product, a key solution towards the climate crisis. However, a large share of our products aren't really recyclable, so they end up as waste on the landfill. So one of the things the industry has done is actually get together as the industries, peers, suppliers, competitors together and say, okay, this has to stop. We're lobbying for a landfill ban of our wind turbine rotor blades, and then kickstart innovation projects that try to solve exactly that challenge, which has led to a situation where everyone in the wind industry, including the developers of wind energy projects, are acutely aware of the situation and are willing to drive these, or like to integrate these requirements for having recyclable or even circular solutions into their tender requirements. And with that sort of thinking, you are able to redefine the playing field altogether. Now, thinking a bit more high level and a bit more long term, even what comes into question here, and I've triggered this question already on the previous slide, is how resilient will your business model be in 10 to 15 years from now? And our understanding of this development is that the question of like, or how you answer that question will depend a lot on how you will answer the question of how your business model will be relevant and what societal challenges you are solving. So on the one hand, it's of course about negative impacts. So trying to eliminate the resource consumption, negative environmental impacts, but also, of course, societal impacts that we see companies having currently in order to provide their products and services, and finding ways to deliver the same value without these environmental or social costs. But on the other hand, it's also a lot more about moving the business model towards a direction where corporations understand themselves as part of the solution. So offering products and services that actually solve some of the biggest challenges we have in society right now, such as the climate crisis, such as the biodiversity crisis, such as democracy being in a crisis, arguably, having access to skilled talent, and having a thriving society comprised of many, many thriving individuals. And these are some of the key considerations that will become relevant in the long term to ensure that the business model is viable in the future. So to move towards a summary, what generates commercial value beyond compliance with a sustainability strategy? There are three elements that I think are important. On the one hand, you need to be able to articulate a very compelling vision and follow up with measurable targets. And the things that Julia has been talking about are very, very relevant to take into consideration here when you're developing that. So it needs to be a compelling vision of what is a truly sustainable company for you in the future. How would that look like? Grounding that in science and internationally recognized social standards. It's generally always long-term focused because the sustainability transformation is something that we're not achieving overnight and that we have been working on for a number of years. So it is not something that we will have done or achieved in 1 to 3 years in the future. And it needs to be, as Julia mentioned, quantitative and with absolute targets in line with the ESRS standards. However, and that point is very important for me to stress, this doesn't work without commercial value integration. Because unless you can showcase towards your leadership, towards your strategy department, towards your finance department, that this is driving commercial value, you will not get the traction to execute on a sustainability strategy. So it has to be deeply integrated into the organization's commercial strategy, and it actually has to work in conjunction with the strategy, not against it. If there are growth targets, for example, for a certain business model or business unit, it needs to be clear, how does this growth relate to, for example, scaling negative environmental impacts? Can we scale those business areas that actually help us solve some of the environmental challenges, not the ones that exacerbate some of the societal challenges that we see? And of course, it needs to drive value creation towards key stakeholders. Obviously, particularly the customers should be in focus here. What do they care about? What are their sustainability targets? What are some of their challenges? And how can a sustainability strategy contribute to solving these? And finally, I think even if you have all these elements in place in terms of the compelling vision, targets, and the commercial value creation, it needs to be clear and crisp. It's a communication exercise, right? So you need to clearly communicate the vision. You need to summarize what you're planning to do concisely. It needs to align with your organization's brand and purpose. So thinking about ethos, pathos, logos. So trying to really anchor it. Where is the organization coming from with its history, and where is it going in the future? And finally, it needs to be well structured and just comprehensible by external stakeholders, because there are so many sustainability strategies out there, and you will have to stand out in order to achieve some of that commercial value creation. So those are, in our view, sort of the key elements and what we try to aspire towards when we work with sustainability strategy in terms of having a successful strategy. And now, before we go into the Q&A, I wanted to share a couple of thoughts with regards to the business model and strategy resilience analysis, with regards to the SBM-3, the Strategy and Business Model 3 disclosure requirements. And the key sort of course, reflection here is that many business models are very much under pressure. And we have seen some of the leading businesses already starting to transform their business model and commercial strategies in order to be viable and commercially competitive in the future. Two examples that come to mind are, of course, Ørsted having transitioned away from fossil fuel-based energy generation towards energy generation that is based on wind, solar, biomass, so renewable energy sources. Another example and a long-standing client of ours, Visman, that comes to mind here is their transformation of transitioning their business away entirely from producing primarily oil and gas boilers, so products that inherently rely on the consumption of fossil fuel-based energy sources, towards a setup where heat pumps, renewable energy solutions, battery storage solutions are in focus in order to be able to be competitive in the future market. And that turned out to be a great bet, specifically also because very much at the same time, the Russia-Ukraine war broke out and there was a massive hit on gas prices. Now, the question, of course, is how the heck am I figuring out whether my business model and my company right now is resilient for the future? And here we have developed a novel approach at Nordic Sustainability, which we are currently testing and piloting with a range of clients, where we go through a series of steps in order to answer exactly that question. So how resilient is our strategy and business model, considering the impacts, risks, and opportunities that we have? And what are our abilities and levers for changing our current business model? And the steps that we're going through here in order to provide an answer, which the answer also ultimately needs to be reported in your sustainability statement, are the following. We start out by mapping the status quo. So what are the results of your double materiality assessment? What is your current commercial business model and strategy? And that needs to be in place in order to drive a successful analysis. The question that in the second step we're asking ourselves then is a simple one, and that's on purpose because we're trying to sort of like bring down the core dynamics to a key question, which is we ask ourselves, if nothing changed, how would material impacts, risks, and opportunities be influenced with each additional euro earned as part of the core business model that we currently have? So for example, if we are in a traditional manufacturing business model where we need one additional unit of raw materials in order to produce an additional or earn an additional euro or Danish krone of revenue, that typically means that there is an additional unit of greenhouse gas emissions, unless we somehow find ways of transitioning away from using virgin raw materials and processing these with energy-intensive processes and relying on fossil fuels and these sorts of things. And that, of course, gives you some indication for how resilient a business model is. If you can't find ways to answer the question of we earn an additional euro more, but we don't have an additional impact, risks, opportunities on the sustainability front, you're having a challenge. So this is sort of the key line of thinking that we're providing as part of answering this question. And then it's, of course, about finding ways to do something about it. So thinking about change levers. And here the financial effects modeling comes into play. So what are actually the current and future financial effects of our material impacts, risks, and opportunities? So trying to figure out what are some of the financial levers that we have to be attentive to in order not to have a disruption to our current business. We think about our ability to address the impacts, risks, and opportunities. So some of them might be located far down in the value chain and we have no direct business contacts. So it will be quite difficult to just exert direct control over these sustainability impacts, risks, and opportunities. Whereas others might have to do something with your own production processes or the own services that you deliver. So here you have a direct control, which of course gives you some indication about, again, how resilient your business model is given the positioning that you have in the current value chain. And then finally, it's about addressing impacts, risks, and opportunities through your business model and strategy. And that's actually, of course, also a key disclosure requirement. You've identified a number of impacts, risks, and opportunities as part of the double materiality assessment. So the question is, what are you doing about them? Are you changing some of the commercial trajectory? Are you implementing any changes in the business model? Are you experimenting with new business models and pilots that could potentially be scaled in the future? So those are some of the questions or that are some of the elements that we think are needed in order to answer that million-dollar question of how resilient is your business model in the future. Great. That was what we had planned to cover for today. And now we're moving into the Q&A section of our webinar. And I'm just going to use the Q&A section here to talk about the first questions coming in. And I invite you, of course, to continue typing away and submitting your questions, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. We have a question from Sari around why there would be a need for sustainability and a commercial strategy. Shouldn't companies just have one future-proof business strategy? And that's a fascinating question, which I agree with the assumption of it. In the ideal world, there are not two different strategies. There isn't a sustainability strategy and a separate commercial strategy. However, that isn't sort of where businesses are currently. I think sort of as an industry and as a profession of sustainability professionals, it is the direction that we need to push towards, that we have commercial strategies and sustainability strategies aligned very closely, because it simply doesn't make sense to do one thing on the commercial side, trying to grow one business model without knowing about what implications this would have for sustainability impacts, risks, and opportunities. And this is actually also what we have been implementing in the past few strategy projects, which have been turning out to be extremely commercially oriented. So, for example, we increasingly complement absolute reduction targets, where it's about, for example, setting a climate target or a water reduction target or these sorts of things, with commercial revenue targets. So thinking about, is there a certain part of your business that we should actually scale because you're providing positive sustainability opportunities here towards your customers? Can you use this as a commercial differentiator? Is there a challenge that you can solve for your customers? And that is sort of the trajectory that we see. So I totally agree with the assumption of the question here. And I think, yes, in the future, I would love to see no differentiation any longer. I'd love to get sort of like the commercial strategy brains and the sustainability strategy brains to get together and figure out the trajectory here. Yeah, as one. Thanks a lot for that question. We have a second anonymous question, which is the following. It looks like the whole process is quite time demanding. In your experience, how long does it take to conduct a full analysis and create a CSRD report following the double materiality assessment requirements? And here, I think I'd love to hand over to Julia, given that she's working with ESRS implementation day to day.
Yeah, so typically we do see the process take, if you're used to writing ESG reports, for example, in Denmark, then we do see that this new CSRD, the report writing itself and development of it takes about 3 to 5 times longer than a typical ESG report. So we always say start early, even if you opt out of a lot of the transitional phase-ins and a lot of transitional provisions you can make use of. For example, saying we are going to adopt a transition plan in a year's time and have a date ready for this adoption. But even if you make use of the majority of the opt-outs and the phase-ins that you have available to you, and you wait to report on the voluntary requirements, even if you set an ambition level at a compliance stage, we do say it takes quite a long time, because you do, as Felix already extensively spoke about early in this presentation, is very much about your narratives under ESRS2. It's writing about all your processes. Even if you don't have them in place, you need a plan to have them in place and need to be able to report on these. So start as early as possible. Even if you have a low ambition level for your first report, it's also about making a roadmap for the next 5 years or for the next 10 years. What is our CSRD reporting going to look like?
And just to add to that, I think I just want to emphasize Julia's point, is that it's important to figure out your own ambition level. I think what we are suggesting to many clients right now is to don't try to like satisfy all of the disclosure requirements, specifically the strategic ones at once. It simply doesn't make sense if you have, let's say, 15, 20, or 25 impacts, risks, and opportunities identified, to spend all of your time in the first year setting targets for them and defining implementation measures. It's a strategic exercise, right? So try to prioritize where you can make the most impact, of course, which impacts, risks, and opportunities are most material in terms of the outcomes of the assessment, and start there. Once you have trained that sort of muscle, you can replicate it. Maybe climate is the area where you want to start if you don't have a climate target yet. And once you have worked with, for example, setting science-based targets, and having scoped the decarbonization levers and implementation projects, you know what it is like to work strategically with sustainability. And then you can update for remaining maybe it doesn't need to be all, but at least for some of the remaining impacts, risks, and opportunities over the years to come. So sort of to go back to the question, it takes some while. A double materiality assessment and figuring out which data you need to report can take, depending on the speed, 3 to 6 months. And you will need sort of at least 6 to 12 months in starting the ESRS implementation. It is just a new standard of reporting, which is much, much more like the financial reporting. And we, as a profession, we're building ground structures here. It will be difficult in the first years to come. Good. Another question, which I thought was quite interesting, was if we could share examples, if available, or resources to look into to assess future financial effects of the risks and opportunities identified from TUBA. I'm actually not able to point to a lot of concrete examples. I think as an industry, we need to do a lot of development work here. So companies have existing enterprise risk management systems where they are able to quantify, for example, some of the commercial risks. The difficult challenge with sustainability risks is that typically the scope that you're looking into is much wider than what we have on the commercial side. So it's a bit like I'm being reminded of the movie of like butterfly effect, right? Like some pollination issue or water scarcity issue in tier 5 of your supply chain can have drastic implications on your ability to deliver a product in the right quality at the right time to the right customer. So it is inherently difficult to quantify the sustainability risks and opportunities. I think the next few years, because there's a phase-in requirement for quantifying financial effects, it does not need to be part of the year 1 disclosures, only qualitatively. For the next few years, there will need to be some standard development around quantifying that. And if anyone here in the room is interested in trying to find joint solutions, we'd just love to team up. I think I just want to be transparent here and say we don't have the full answer, but we're pretty interested in defining a full answer together. Thank you for that question. I'd like to take Alejandro's question next, because I think that's on many of our minds right now. How would the planned omnibus regulation affect the strategy and reporting? Of course, the short answer to the question is that nobody knows, because we are all just reading lots of news articles and are trying to follow whatever materializes on the EU level here. For everyone who hasn't been aware of what's happening there right now, the EU Commission is considering to review and unite some of the key sustainability legislations as published as part of the Green Deal agenda into one legislative package. For example, and that would specifically refer to the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and then the EU taxonomy, so the EU's approach to defining what is a sustainable economic activity. The idea here is to lower reporting burdens and bureaucratic work for European companies by pulling these different pieces of legislations together and thereby trying to dampen a hit on European competitiveness, economically speaking. With regards to how this shift will affect the strategy and the reporting, I think right now we have very limited information. The articles and information out there is that there's a risk that this could sort of like trigger a weakening of some of the requirements that are currently being mandatory. However, also the Commission has stressed that the general ambition level hasn't changed. And it just makes sense, right? If the 3 packages in total, they are part of one push towards trying to align the private sector with the EU agenda on the Green Deal. So I think it's unlikely that we'll see one of these elements being completely removed. I think what is likely that we'll see is that we will get a further discussion around which requirements apply to which companies, about the extensiveness of data collection and reporting, and discussions related to that. I think at this point, sort of giving clear answers on the implications would be nothing but taking a look into the crystal ball. So I'll stop talking here, but I just want to add the final point that what we see is companies have started to prepare, some of them 2 years ago, with the EU taxonomy even earlier. And we are moving towards a phase where we are seeing the first CSRD-aligned reports being out there. And of course, EU taxonomy reporting has been done also a couple of times by some companies. So I wouldn't magically expect this to go away and sort of like open opportunity to completely get rid of reporting requirements. And I think it also wouldn't be in line with some of the commercial thoughts I have provided about why it can be valuable to use sustainability strategically. I hope that answers it, Alejandro, and I'm interested to hear. Feel free to contact us if you've heard anything else interesting. And yeah, we're certainly all following the agenda quite closely. Good. Then we have a couple of other questions. Sorry, a bit difficult to choose between the many of them. Thank you so much for submitting them. We have a question from Anna around how do you see beyond value chain targets on biodiversity becoming a part of companies' commercial sustainability strategy, and how can it be incorporated in the ESRS process? As part of the ESRS requirements, there needs to be a transition plan on biodiversity. And of course, these requirements need to be taken into consideration whenever setting targets that also go beyond the value chain. I think an important element with biodiversity targets is, of course, that biodiversity impacts are almost always, by definition, extremely local, which makes sense. Which also makes sense that targets are being set where impacts occur. And it also makes sense from sort of a commercial perspective on trying to mitigate some of the, let's say, supply chain disruption risks locally. With regards to sort of like how I see beyond value chain targets, I think they're gaining increasing relevance with regards to the standards. And I think that the biodiversity transition plan is probably the key disclosure requirements that you would want to look towards to if you are thinking about setting these targets for your supply chain or downstream value chain as part of biodiversity actions. We have another question around how external auditors fit into this. So the question is if it is good practice to involve them early on. And the clear answer to that is yes. Julia, do you want to elaborate a bit more?
So we always recommend involving your external auditors as early as possible, and already when you're starting to do your double materiality analysis. Of course, different parts of your CSRD and ESRS reporting goes through assurance. Your double materiality assessment is one of them. Your information materiality, so what are you actually going to be reporting on? And then, of course, your report itself. And having an ongoing and good dialogue with them from the start is just critical. Especially because we're seeing very many auditors and different auditing houses approach it slightly differently. So of course, making sure you consistently align with your auditors through every step of the process is just key to not have any bottlenecks close to your reporting deadline.
Exactly. And I think as we are nearing the end of time, I'm selecting here a last question that we'd like to discuss in plenum here. And the question is, I think, also a fitting last one, because of course, in the end, we're not all not only professionals, we're also private citizens, we're consumers. So the question is how we can, as consumers, analyze company targets to ensure that we're putting our money towards products that follow guidelines similar that align with our sustainability, our own private sustainability goals. I think there's different components to that answer. The first one that I can think of is that with the new standards, we will have a new level of comparability. Given that targets, we are moving away from a wishy-washy approach where you can specify targets without specifying a baseline, without quantifying it, and so on and so forth. We are having much more data around environmental performance, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on and so forth. So we can use that sort of information for our decision making. But of course, as private citizens, we're not really analysts going around the supermarket or the fashion store reading sustainability reports on the go. So what I would just recommend you to do on a private level, which is what I'm doing, is to find a couple of companies where you can see that the leadership is pushing for actions that go far beyond the scope of what they would have to do to be in line with regulation right now. So specifically for fashion, for many other consumer products, there are champions out there. There are companies who have worked with the topic for many, many years, who provide information on a product level. Many companies have moved to a state where you can trace the product in the value chain, which materials are being used, having life cycle assessments. And what I do personally, maybe that's because I don't like to think about too much of what I buy from where, but I stick to these brands and I'm loyal to them once I found them. That is at least my very private approach to that. Thanks a lot for that question. And with that, we are nearing the end of the time. I'd like to thank you all for dialing in, specifically for all of the great questions that you've provided. As mentioned before, we'll be sharing the recording and the slides. And please, this is an open invitation to reach out to us, because a lot of the difficult questions around sustainability strategy, we will need to figure out together, specifically, for example, with regards to the financial risks and opportunities. There are many things that we need to solve together as a sustainability professional community. So thanks a lot for dialing in, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye.